Thanks for joining us. Super excited for this conversation here with Stephen Young to talk about SARC and their super important mission. Makes a lot of sense for us to have this conversation now with this being Sarcoma Awareness Month. So, Stephen, thanks so much for taking the time to chat.
It's truly a pleasure and an honor.
Oh, no, I will take it.
And an honor, yes.
All right, so let's start off by learning a little bit more about SARC. Can you kind of tell us about the mission of the organization?
A good place to start would be what does SARC exist? SARC was founded in 2003 by the sarcoma investigator community to foster and drive team science collaborations. And that's important to understand because the vast majority of foundations, nonprofit foundations, cancer foundations, are founded by patients, survivors, caregivers, if you will, the patient side of the fence. And so SARC has been rather uniquely structured to facilitate and drive team science and clinical studies. So really, I think the shortest way to answer the question is, what makes SARC unique? We're the only sarcoma research consortium that isn't associated with the federal government, to my knowledge. We actually drive and facilitate these studies, and as I said, allow investigators to collaborate not only within the United States, but globally.
And when you think about rare disease like sarcoma, what about that makes the collaborative research model that you just mentioned so important to SARC?
Most cancers that we all think of, breast cancer, lung cancer, et cetera, the numbers of patients are measured in hundreds of thousands in the United States, and then even more so, obviously, internationally. Sarcoma is total about 17 to 18,000 newly diagnosed patients a year. And that's spread across about 80 to 100, 110 different subtypes. So in essence, sarcoma is a group of ultra rare and rare cancers. And the only way to study rare diseases, any rare disease, is through the power of numbers. And so what SARC does is pull together and help facilitate collaborations across where the patients may be clinically, whether in a local hospital or they've gone to a regional medical center or they've gone to a major academic center. SARC pulls all those people together. So a consortium structure is vital to capture enough patient data and information so that we can actually statistically ask and answer the questions that have to be answered to understand how to get a drug approved or a new diagnostic tool vetted and validated.
Well, okay, that's really interesting and some great insight. I think thanks for sharing that with the audience. Let's get into the nuts and bolts a bit and pivot a little bit to the actual operations of the projects that you're engaged in. And when people think about clinical trials, they often think about the science, but there's a tremendous amount of operational and regulatory work involved in running the types of studies that you do, right? Large multi-site trials. And so from your experience in running these type of complex projects, where do some of the biggest challenges arise?
Well, any endeavor where you're trying to get multiple groups, disparate groups with similar but different administrative, legal, cultural differences, you need to navigate that. SARC lives a rather unique structure because we actually are the regulatory sponsor of our own trials. I think back to your point, Ish, most people think of clinical trials as drug companies paying to have their drugs studied to get FDA approval. Well, there's a whole nother element of clinical trials where the investigators are trying to ask and answer key baseline scientific and clinical questions that are divorced or precursors, if you will, to a more commercial mindset towards things. The output of SARC are publications, quite frankly, illuminating the field of battle. And I think that has influenced the complexity of what we're doing because SARC, as I said, is the sponsor of our trials, not the pharmaceutical companies. So we are working with the investigators in the major academic centers to develop ideas and then critically, to your point, effectuate them. And the process of testing unproven drugs or compounds or agents in people is wrought with complexity. And we'll get to it later on, I think, in our conversation. That's why it's so critical for SARC not only to have internal expertise, but to be able to rely on expertise not only within our academic centers for the science and medicine and sometimes some of the business aspects, but more importantly, SARC as a sponsor to be able to approach for example, your firm to get guidance or advice and feedback or validation of our approaches.
You make a really good point about how complex it is to wrangle all these different stakeholders. In your trials, you're dealing with pharma, you're dealing with the federal government, you're dealing with the sites, and trying to wrangle them all to play nice in the sandbox together, so to speak. And it's interesting because earlier today I did a webinar for ACRP about e-consent and what the roadblocks are to higher adoption and implementation of e-consent. And we really, went down the rabbit hole of how these stakeholders all have different outcomes that they're trying to get through the e-consent platforms, right? Similar to kind of the trials that you're running. And so I think, the complexity of wrangling multiple stakeholders with different desired outcomes into an efficient operational model can prove to be quite a complex undertaking. And so as we, do a deeper dive into this question, perhaps, what are some of the types of questions that don't come up every day but are critical when they do?
So I use the term, and I don't typically use it publicly, but what we really do is spend a lot of time herding the cats. And the good news in this, particularly in the space of rare cancers, rare diseases such as sarcoma, is the cats want to be herded, meaning they want to work together. The esprit de corps among the sarcoma investigators and the major sarcoma centers is rather extraordinary. And to your point, the devil is in the detail, however, and how to make that happen in a timely manner. We're dealing with institutions that have some are state institutions, and they have complexities of being part of the government. We have other centers that have a culture of we're the inventors of X, Y, and Z, and we're God's gift to research, and they may indeed be so. But the bottom line is, as I said earlier, we have to figure out a way to make these folks work together, play nicely in the sandbox, not in terms of relationships or personalities, but operationally. Because again, it doesn't take much to slow down the launch of a clinical study whose, again, ultimate goal is to illuminate the field so that we can build and build and build upon those results. So I'd say the biggest challenge is getting through the knotholes of delays and trying to anticipate delays and critically understanding where the delays are likely to be and then proactively address. And so working with Attain and other partners and collaborators, we have 10 different investigator voluntary committees that actually work together on this as well. But operationally, the devil is in the detail. As I said earlier, SARC is the sponsor of the study, and you guys have great experience in this space because, in essence, SARC sometimes work as what's called a contract research organization. But we're also a site management organization, meaning we work with the investigator sites driving those through. So SARC, in some ways, is neither fish nor fowl. We straddle those two worlds. And because we're straddling two worlds, there aren't always easy answers on how to approach something. The academic centers have their viewpoint. The drug companies have their viewpoint. The federal government have their viewpoint. The patient advocacy and all communities groups do. And navigating that in a way that so we still get the study done in a timely manner, but at the same time get quality data in as fast as possible and quite frankly as efficiently as possible. At the end of the day, as I said earlier, these are a group of sarcomas are a group of very rare, ultra rare cancers. There's usually not a lot of funding available for this. And so we have to do a lot with a little. And the advantage of working with collaborators and partners is to leverage some of their expertise, but also to make sure that we can vet and validate our own approaches so that we can't afford mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. We have to keep those to a limited amount so that we can get things done in a timely manner.
You said something there that really kind of resonated with me in my own personal journey in clinical trials and clinical research. As you mentioned, all these physicians who voluntarily are part of these committees. And when you first enter clinical research, at least for me, I had no idea how important investigators' personal passion for solving and improving the treatment for diseases, how important really that is to the entire enterprise, and what a driver that truly is to the rate at which we advance science. When you talk to sites about growing their clinical trial portfolios, where you always start is, who are your investigators that are interested in doing this work? And so I think what you said is one manifestation highlighting that dynamic of how important that is, and that really speaks to the mission of your organization that you mentioned earlier, in that this was built from the ground up by the investigator community. It wasn't a patient centered development. You said also something there that I think is really important. As we know, the funding paradigm for research with the federal government has changed quite a bit over the last 2 years. As nonprofits, a lot of your organization and other groups like yours and sites have already been running on lean teams. So when you look at the current financial landscape in terms of obtaining funding, always coupled with the increasing complexity of the requirements to do the studies, what are some things you think about in terms of balancing a lean team so you can remain financially viable with those increasingly complex requirements for trials?
I want to address a comment you made a little bit earlier in that question, which is the essentiality, if you will, the centrality of a motivated investigator within their center to break through some of the, quite frankly, administrative or bureaucratic barriers. Over time, I'm seeing some investigators who are super passionate, but their voice is being, if you will, not listened to as intently as they were recently. And that's, as you said, is due to the economics of our healthcare system. And the centers are under financial pressure, and they're less likely or less willing to sweep expenses under the carpet, robbing Peter to pay Paul, if you will, to get these studies through. And I'm seeing an increasing trend of some of the major academic centers, and it's not their fault, that are getting tougher and tougher on the budget negotiations, contract negotiations. That said, it's still essential to have the investigator, the person who's actually investigators who are taking care of the patients and are really the frontline troops of these centers, to be advocating and driving this forward. And so we've seen clear examples of breaking down those barriers. And the second part of the discussion is, how does SARC navigate this in a way that is truly collaborative? And I will say, not when I say herding the cats earlier, it's not just the investigators. The institutions themselves generally are motivated as well to do these multi-center studies. The difference is SARC, as a 501c3 public nonprofit charity, does not have the deep pockets of, for example, a federal grant, the National Institutes of Health funded study, or the other side of the coin, a industry, biopharmaceutical industry supported and funded study. So with the institutions under increasing financial pressure, so is SARC. We have to keep our team lean, mean, and fighting machine, if you will. And to that end, we have to minimize our expenditures. And the way we can do that is by only engaging expertise when we need it. I'd say 3/4 of the year, four-fifths of the year, we can navigate and drive forward without necessarily having to engage expertise. On occasion, we do so. And as I mentioned earlier, working with an external collaborator partner, as far as I'm concerned, with Attain, we can actually effectuate and be more efficient and lean, and above all, cut time. Time is the enemy of research, and the delays it takes to ask and answer questions. Every day, every week that goes by is a week or a day that the results are delayed. And so I think this is a very efficient model for us, hopefully from Attain's side as well. And I think it's going to start bearing fruit in terms of our operational efficiency as an organization, working with our academic partners, as I've said, but also it also helps us really understand some of the drivers on the biopharmaceutical side. or changes in the regulatory environment with new regulations coming out for example, National Institutes of Health. Bottom line is we're dealing with complexity. And again, the rules are changing, the field's evolving, and we have to evolve with it. And the more we can anticipate, the more effective and efficient we can be. And thus, we can invest more of our funds into the research instead of spending it against the clock, which is unfortunately how many dollars are sucked away in the research world. Is delays are endemic because it's complex. What we're all doing is very complex.
You said something there that I wanted to comment on, and that is sites getting harder with budget negotiations, and to the extent they're willing to subsidize their research programs, so to speak. And what we've seen on our side is increased friction between the hospital and the research arm of the organization, right? A lot of these universities have their affiliated hospitals, and part of this is driven by a change in the way Medicare does payments. So 5 to 6 years ago, they went to batched payments where you don't get their fee for every line item in a particular patient visit, right? You get I'm oversimplifying this, but you get the highest amount procedure paid for in a given visit. And if you look at the coverage analysis industry historically, what they're doing is they're finding coverage for procedures, finding that Medicare will cover certain procedures, which of course drives down the cost of the sponsor because the sponsor is no longer paying for that. But the Medicare coverage analysis industry hasn't evolved to also tell sites, yes, you have coverage for this, but this is what you're actually going to collect with billing it the way that you've done the study. And because sites aren't considering, the financial impact of their coverage determinations, the hospitals end up having to write off, a bunch of these charges. And that's what's increasing the friction on the two sides of the house. And I bring this all up because, this is a hot topic in the coverage analysis industry. And one of the things we've worked on as an organization is for our coverage analysis clients, being able to also provide them what we're calling a prospective reimbursement analysis so that they can say, yes, we have coverage for this, but if we bill it this way, this is what we're actually going to recover, because there are some real conversations to be had about, has the change in insurance billing shifted the cost from insurance to the sites as opposed to from insurance to the sponsors? And so I think that's a real thing financially that our industry is going to have to grapple with and figure out.
Well, I like how you put that, because the reality is research is caught in between those two stress points. I use the term robbing Peter to pay Paul. That's basically how much of the expense of research has been sort of absorbed into the process. All of us are taxpayers. We appreciate tightening down and being more efficient with our taxpayer dollars, and the Medicare front, not wasting dollars by paying either for unneeded tests, et cetera. But the reality is you're taking capital out of the process, which is a good thing from a taxpayer standpoint. But to your point, it's highlighting the fact that you can no longer sweep expenses under the carpet. And therefore, what we're seeing is institutions, and I don't blame them at all, the bean counters within the centers saying, well, we have to pay for the elevators or the escalators and the person sweeping the floor and security, and I go on and on. How do we cover all those expenses? Because it's not just the explicit cost of getting an MRI, for example, done in the machine. It's all the overhead that goes along with it. And so I think you're absolutely right. That we're seeing, I'd say, over the last 4 to 5 years, and that's nothing to do with politics, 4 or 5, 10 years, an increasing trend of institutions not being able to say, okay, for you, we'll do it for X dollars. Because at the end of the day, it's still costing them. I mean, as an organization, this is a constant stress factor for us. How do we cover the overhead, the indirect cost of running a complex organization? And I think what's happening is, as you said, institutions are no longer, whether it's the academic center or the clinical hospital, the hospital where the patients are being seen, those costs are now becoming more visible, and therefore they have to be captured some way or the other. And as I said, that brings us full circle to how SARC has to not only, of course, increase our operating budgets with our what we can reimburse the institutions for doing this research. But we therefore have to become that much more efficient as an organization so that we also minimize our overhead. So that, as I said earlier, every dollar we raise either through federal grants or from grants from pharmaceutical companies or from groups like PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which was founded by Congress. There are a whole bunch of entities where you raise these funds from, and to do clinical trials, we're talking, $1 million, $2, $3, $4 million typically across a clinical trial. So every dollar that you can be more efficient, you can invest those into the research. But really, to that point, we have to understand the pressures, the cost pressures on the centers, so that we can go back to them with a realistic but affordable budget from our side, and not go in there saying, okay, you can do an MRI for $200. No, you can't. You can barely do a blood draw for $200 now. So we just have to be more aware of that. Again, navigating it with you guys, with your ability to have the benefit of working with multiple clients and your internal expertise will result in us being better at our jobs and, as I said, being more effective and efficient with our trials.
I think that's a nice segue into talking a little bit about what that model looks like of us collaborating together, because I think it is somewhat of a unique model. And so the way that we're set up, right, is we just have this overarching agreement, and you can essentially come to us with any questions or issues that you have, and we kind of estimate out how much time that we'll take, and we go from there. So when you look at, specialized questions that come up, do you find this model being conducive to those questions not being roadblocks in terms of the timeline of your study activation?
So in essence, SARC runs and facilitates what are called investigator-initiated trials. So the idea comes from Dr. X at an academic center, and he or she approaches us and says, I have this idea for a study and they want to take it forward. Well, why do they approach SARC in the first place? It's because of our ability to effectuate a multi-center study. You could still do a single-site investigator-initiated study within, I'll pick on Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York. They could do a trial, but because we're dealing with a rare population, it would take years to get the trial done, many years to get the trial done versus working with us. And I bring that up as an example because in Memorial Sloan Kettering or MD Anderson Cancer Center, all these major centers have multiple departments that live, breathe, and eat this space. And so therefore an investigator can go to their regulatory department or their legal affairs or patient compliance or data privacy or biostatistics. With SARC, we can go to some of our centers, but the reality is we don't have that infrastructure built into our organization. And so by working collaboratively now, as I said, with our investigators to get ideas on study design and the landmines that slow things down, so too can we work with your group, almost like you're a set of departments for us that we can consult with on as an needed basis or a PRN basis. And that's much more cost effective for us. And it's also very time effective. For us to navigate, for example, an academic center and asking advice on how are you dealing with the new regulation on how quickly data needs to be published, it could take weeks to even get an answer from someone. So we can get an answer from you guys virtually within hours and have a consult in a way that can drive us forward. So that's just an example of how SARC has evolved its business model over the years to become, as I said, lean and as efficient as we can. But we're imperfect animals. We don't have all the answers in-house, and it's sometimes great to be able to vet and validate them with external partners.
We have this on-demand kind of hybrid model that we're operating under now, right? Other avenues of solutions you could explore is hiring additional staff. You could engage in what the consulting industry calls assessments, right? These large scale consulting projects that give you a roadmap for organizational transformation. Hopefully you implement some of it and don't just put the report on the shelf. That's always what our consultants are thinking about. But why do you find this kind of on-demand model more appealing than engaging in one of these large-scale consulting projects or hiring a full-time employee?
And that the answer to that is driven by the natural workflow, the ebbs and flow of clinical trials coming through the organization. At any point in time, we have typically anywhere from 3 to 5, sometimes 6 clinical trials going on at any point in time. Each of them are their own life cycle. Some are in startup phase, some are actively enrolling, others are in data cleanup, and others are in analysis of the biospecimens to come up with answer some of the science questions. So we don't have that steady. It's not like we have a steady state of work where we can justify to ourselves bringing in, for example, a regulatory affairs expert. That's just an example, or a full-time attorney. We outsource contracting, and we, just like with you, we go to our attorney on an as-needed basis and work with her firm for an hour or two, sometimes three, and we get the answer and we move on. If we had all that built-in overhead, we would increase our overhead structure for the organization, and we'd have inefficiencies. So it's a lot more efficient for us to do, as you call it, an on-demand model, because we're only paying for, I hate to put it this way, we're only paying for the work that we need to get done instead of someone sitting around waiting for work to come down the pike. The major academic centers 20, 30, 40 years ago, they'd have people sitting around waiting for work to be done. Not anymore. It's I can picture visually, if you go into an academic center now, the workload stacked this high on their desks, and they're just prioritizing, delays. So what SARC's been doing rather effectively is, by going with the on-demand model, we reduce our overhead. And as I said earlier, that allows us to get work done with least amount of money that we can into so-called administrative or regulatory operational things, so that we can funnel those into paying for MRIs, or collections of data, or shipping of specimens, or analyzing them in the labs. So the actual work of the study can be done, as opposed to consuming too much of it with overhead. So it's worked really well for us, and it's working. And over the last year, we're already seeing some of the benefits of that, increasing our efficiencies.
It's interesting to hear your experience about that, because the whole reason I exist in the consulting industry is because I felt like there was a need for an on-demand model, not in the particular space that we were talking about, but to your point, universities staff to capacity. Meaning, if this is how much work needs to get done, we're going to have exactly just enough staff to do that amount of work. And of course, then everybody has a goal to increase their portfolio, right? And so there's this need, really, in a ton of research operational areas, to have a on-demand, cost-effective model with cost certainty to address these overflow or specialized situations. So my whole foray into consulting was initially because I was running a research contracts team at a big, university. And whenever we had turnover or staffing changes, the answer was always ish, just do two or three jobs until you hire and train somebody. And maybe sometimes they'd let me use salary savings for external counsel. But what I found with external counsel is it was an hourly based thing, and that doesn't necessarily incentivize efficiency, and it doesn't create cost certainty. And so, what I like about these on demand models and the contracting model that I've created in the consulting space is that you pay for production, right? And I think that's what we all want. And so I think these on demand models and kind of the way we have this structured, I think it's just going to become more and more prevalent in the consulting industry. We've been working with SARC since the second or third quarter of last year, and we've worked on DD gap requirements for depositing data with the federal government. We've worked on the FATA reporting related to subawards and subaward structures and contracting strategies. We're looking at research project manager assessments, and we've done some clinical operation and compliance questions as well. So, Stephen, can you share a little bit about any upcoming trials or additional SARC priorities?
So on average, SARC has sponsored and initiated about one new clinical trial per year since we were founded in 2003. We've run and sponsored over 30 phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trials since founding. We've established internally a development committee that actually is ideating and developing studies. Instead of waiting for ideas to come to us, we're actually getting the investigators together and brainstorming and creating new trials from within sort of an intramural viewpoint of developing studies. That will the positive outcome of that will be not only more and better ideas to select from, but also the output will be more clinical trials. So we're getting into a run rate of launching anywhere from 2 to 4 new trials a year over the next 2 years. And as you mentioned earlier, institutions are structured so that they basically have the staffing that they need for the work that they need to do then. And I was thinking about the movie, not to age myself, but Field of Dreams with Kevin Costner, where he's building a baseball field out in the middle of cornfields and waiting for people and players to show up. We can't afford to build it and wait, build it and hopefully they will come, because in the meantime we're carrying those expenses. So the on-demand model, as we keep calling it, is an absolutely beautiful way to lay up and build the capacity as we build up our business pipeline, our trial pipeline, in an efficient manner so that we can actually effectuate these clinical trials. And so, as I said, we're going to be launching 2 clinical trials this year. Our plan is to launch 3 to 4 new trials next year and get into a sort of a run rate of launching 2 to 3 new trials a year. So as we get into there and we start having 6, 8, 12 studies open at a time, we have to increase our staffing. But in the meantime, the efficiencies are we're not building it and they will come. We're actually buying the expertise that we need on an as needed basis. And that's obviously much more effective, cost effective, and time effective. And so we're really thrilled to be working with you guys and critically working with our investigator community to increase the throughput, because at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is getting new drugs and new diagnostic devices to patients so that they can be diagnosed more quickly and be treated more effectively. The 5-year survival rate for sarcoma is anywhere from, I guess on average, I'm looking down at my paper, sorry, I just want to make sure I say it right, is about 65%. And I contrast that with breast cancer. Breast cancer in the 1970s, the 5-year survival rate was 75%. Today, it's greater than 90, 92, 95%. Why? Because the incredible advocacy communities have pulled together and gotten billions of dollars invested into breast cancer research. Sarcoma, as a much smaller disease, has to do something analogous to that. And I'm not patting ourselves on the back. SARC is uniquely structured to help facilitate that vision of driving these progress forward so the patients can be diagnosed more quickly, treated more effectively, and obviously have improved quality of life. So we're really thrilled about our directionality. We are constantly seeking funding support. SARC, as I mentioned earlier, is not founded by patients. So we don't do walk runs and galas. Our funds are coming through, if you will, grants, competitive grants from the federal government or from industry partners or from other foundations. And so I would make a plea, if you don't mind me making a plea at the end, anybody that is passionate about rare diseases or rare cancers or sarcoma in particular, please reach out to us and we can explain our model more effectively. And hopefully maybe you can see yourself through effectuating a better future for sarcoma patients by partnering with us. So I thank Attain. I thank you all for what you're doing. We're together, we're poised for greatness, if you will, as a field, sarcoma. I'm very optimistic about where it's going. And I'll close by saying thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephen. Appreciate you taking the time to chat, and really exciting to hear about SARC's direction. I'm going to ask you one final question to put you on the spot, even though you already said thank you. If somebody only watched 2 minutes of this video and you want to make sure they take one thing away from it in relation to SARC, what is that thing?
SARC was founded for one reason, to solve the critical issue of cancer research. Sarcomas are rare. The individual medical centers don't have enough patients and bandwidth to do the trials on their own. And it's only through team science and collaborations that sarcoma advancements are going to happen. And we are working beautifully with the patients, survivors, caregivers, pharmaceutical companies, and academic centers and federal governments. At the end of the day, we are a change agent, and that's what I would hope you would think of us. We're a facilitator, enabler, or a so-called catalyst. We reduce how much energy it takes to get stuff done. That's really what SARC is. And we are unique in the sarcoma space. There are federal groups out there, they're called cooperative groups, et cetera, but they're across all cancers. This is, as far as I know, the only sarcoma-specific consortium, and we represent 100 different subtypes that are driving this forward. Some subtypes might have 20 patients, others may have 500 patients. We actually can drive them all together forward in a collaborative manner as best we can, at least. The key to this is access to funding, patients, data, and above all, the investigators who are the scientific clinical creators of all this. SARC is a facilitator. Things aren't invented here. What we do is take these great ideas and effectuate them into the real world. So if that's a sort of a long-winded summary. It's not 2 minutes, but that's a long-winded summary of where we are and where we're headed. And we love to partner with anybody out there that has the same enemy we do, which is sarcoma cells and helping patients.
Well, that is wonderful to hear, and thanks again for taking the time to talk to us about SARC, and looking forward to all the great things we can accomplish together moving forward.
I agree. Thank you.